Okay. So I thank you very much for your excellent presentation of my career, as well as the achievements of IDRiM right from the start till today, and good work being done. So I am not only pleased, but it is honored to be invited by IDRiM for this lecture, 6 lectures. So I think I welcome all those who have joined us, and I and request them to bear with my presentation, which may be because of my very senior age, some here and there. So please bear with me with my presentation. All right, let me then start. Okay, the I, before just starting with the what I should talk about, then I thought two things I should do. I should catch up what has been talked by the previous lecturers, at least at the last 3 lecturers. And then I will see how uh, we are going to emphasize, highlight those, or add to that whatever has. They, I, to me, as you all know, the first slide shows my sequence of presentation. And the next slide, please. Next one. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I think that today the world is challenged in increasing environmental risks and the environment of uncertainty and complexity than ever. Vulnerability of social environment systems has significantly enhanced due to transformation of the relations between society and nature. We live in a highly interdependent and complex world, forced with faced with unprecedented risks and disasters. Conventional understanding, therefore, of disaster risk or disaster has changed its realm to encompass psychosocial dimensions, more wider economic dimensions, and so on. So, in the current context of complexity, scientists are now engaged in promoting implementation science and risk science that would focus on more realistic understanding of human vulnerability risk and inclusive disaster risk resilience and enhance capacity of society for sustainable disaster management. And also at the same time, emphasize human dignity and human rights. In the current context, I thought it is it should be useful if you have a retrospect what we have done till now in IDRiM, what we can rethink, what we can refine, and how to go ahead. So in that context, my presentation it deals with this sort of highlighting these points. Now, the I say the IDRiM to me is an evolving concept. The last decade achievement has been commendable, and it has consolidated the the theoretical base for IDRiM. And I think a strong theoretical base has been there already there. But in my opinion, this we have reached successfully its first mile of the long path ahead. A long way to go to reach the last mile with knowledge, skill, capacity to design methods and mechanisms for better implementation. So this is one I think it's a long way, long path ahead of IDRiM. It has to be more meaningful and to the people and also in to the society. Next slide, please. Yeah, I was just catching up with what has been talked about, the major points of last three lectures. So I found that the third lecture by David, uh, he emphasized on complexity and intersectionality towards redefinition of disaster science and evolution of item theory, according to him, has failed to keep pace with the evolution of society and technology. That was the major points what David Alexander talked about in third lecture. Fourth lecture, Professor Wren, no, I think before, previous one. Fourth lecture, Professor Wren said inclusive resilience. Its adaptive, coping, and participating aspects. And he also focused on organizational learning and cope with stress. Then the last lecture, by Andrew Collins, he focused on people-centered approach, reduction of human vulnerability, and promote health and well-being. So next slide, please. So before I start, I think why rethink IDRiM? We have a retrospect of what we have achieved till now. Where do we stand at this stage? So I have just listed few things which comes to mind. Are we prepared for these things in IDRiM as a IDRiM society? To promote, to, to promote inclusive resilience in disaster-prone areas for the most vulnerable, including the disabled, and designing methods and mechanisms to promote community-led disaster management, what I call CLDM. This is not a new thing which I'm coming up. It's been talked about years now. That is community-led disaster management. This next, I think, to plan and implement IDRiM actions in the environment of uncertainty and complexity, and to design methods and mechanisms required for it. This is another area which I thought important area. The third is deal with varied emerging social issues, such as reducing vulnerability related to inequality and social discrimination, and devise strong systems to promote social capital. And social capital, I will also add human capital in this. Next slide. The next one I thought important to rethink on, to reduce potential local social conflict, the data peace and community sustainability. Conflict and disaster, we know, are intertwined in both phases. So the reducing conflict at the local level, at the social conflicts, there are many areas where these conflicts lead to and deter any kind of effort on disaster management. Then the last one I thought to talk of design smart governance at local level and mechanisms for stronger collaboration among stakeholders. All these five I've just noted to say, for me, the answer to all this, no, we have not yet reached. We are not prepared for each of these in this. And therefore, rethinking IDRiM and paradigm, its perspectives for right direction on the road ahead is important. Next slide, please. I think in this case, I want to raise an important point. This one is that I think it might be helpful to, in the context of rethinking, key areas of IDRiM. What are the key areas where we can rethink? Review of IDRiM paradigm and its future role to present a primer on realities of emerging disaster scenario, particularly the environment of enhanced uncertainty and complexity and human suffering, and then how to build resilient systems and communities. These are some of the things are very important key areas where rethinking is necessary. The nature of risk becomes increasingly complex and systemic. IDRiM objectives must be systemic, charting on a wider horizon of protection from hazards to life-sustaining system. This is very important, I think, not only for responding to the disaster and getting preparedness, but also getting prepared to protect and sustain our life-sustaining systems, human suffering and well-being. So these are some of the areas which I think very important, which comes out the frontline key areas for us to think about. So the proposed IDRiM implementation task force, which has been really proposed now, I think this is a very right step to go ahead. And it has a long way to go, but the idea of creating a task force within the IDRiM society is one of the very most welcome steps taken. Next, please. And overwhelming uncertainties. I was just, when I was writing this, I thought, where to start with? Everything seems to be the world uncertain, right from your life to environment to conflict and whatnot. Uncertainties aglow everywhere. Pattern of severity of climate change impact has changed from crisis. It was called a climate change crisis in 2019, just 3-4 years back. It became so severe, it was called emergency in 2022. And now, currently, it is called a deadly. So you see these changes which climate change impact has taken over. And it may be for various reasons. I think largely due to our inaction or right way of approaching the Next is growing threats to mass-scale human disaster and human safety and human suffering. This I will explain, elaborate further in my talk, because this is one important thing, I strongly believe that IDRiM cannot be diverse from protecting human suffering, reducing human suffering, and also the, in the context of regional conflicts and wars, this is becoming rather very key and strong debate all over the world now. So next is trained in diversion of resources meant for DR to regional. This is something which I want to point out. So much of now the war going on, conflict going. We know what is happening in Sweden. We know what is happening in Gaza, in Israel, in Iran, in Iraq, in all the places full of conflict than ever before. So, and along with that, the military expenditure, the fighting things are going higher. You will be surprised to see the statistics on this within the last 3 years, 4 years. And the military hardware preparation, manufacturing has also gone up very high. So military hardware market is a booming market nowadays. So I think most of the things are happening. It is taking away many resources of the world. The resources could be diverted, could be used for disaster management. So I think this is an area which is very little known till now. And that. Next is global collaboration to lead with climate change realities and manage funding resources. We know about this. How the all the UN meetings and international conferences have said that how the technology and funding transfer from the rich country to the poor country would follow. This has been going on for quite some time, and they actually agreed upon shift of funding has not taken place till now. From to, now you know, I'm not going into details of this, but till now it's going on, and the whatever changes are coming in the international collaboration for climate change is moving very slowly and in uncertain ways. I think if we miss this uh, this chance of getting strongly into controlling climate change, it will be a disaster of disasters in very near future. Next, please. So then I thought, let's try to take a big picture, ponder over. What is that big picture I'm talking about? Is this when IDRiM is moving towards people-centric policies, and action should it not be more concerned about humanitarianism and human rights? This is one thing which strikes my mind and thinking always. How far IDRiM society within its mission and objective could be concerned with human suffering, mass scale human suffering, and over the world, and human rights too. Everyone is entitled to be safe and fully protected from all disaster risks. That is a fundamental right of each person. And IDRiM, I think, would fail in its responsibility in this aspect is neglected, not effectively addressed. I strongly believe, so one has to think about it, how IDRiM can contribute or reduce this. So can or should the objectives of IDRiM therefore incorporate reduction, mitigation of large-scale human disasters and human suffering in all disaster-prone areas? That is what I'm concluding in this. If so, how to go ahead? What new knowledge, mechanisms, governance systems, and networking need to be evolved? Next slide, please. Next one. Next slide, please. Yeah. Yeah, I have just very briefly said about the current global scenario. I need not repeat this. This has been talked about at many conferences, papers, and so on. And it will be alarming to know that uh, this has led to, some people say that these sort of conflicts are so deeper and widely impacting people and people's life and life than never since World War II. The condition is so widely spread globally. And then it has reached that complexity, as I talked about, and uncertainty. The resultant human disaster is astounding. 2024, a number of people forced displacement by violent regional conflict and terrorism was 130 million in the world. Forced displacement due to conflict and war. Israel, Hamas were internally I need not go into details. These are all in public domain now, and you can know. So you'll see what kind of, and what I think human suffering is appalling, much greater than any large cascading disaster. So this raises a point to my mind that how far IDRiM can be concerned with this sort of human suffering and mass scale refugees, mass scale displacement, and which continues over a long time. You know what has happened to Sudan? One of my very best friends of in Sudan was shifting from one country to another. He cannot go back because of the conflict of so many years now. And so Billions of people have been suffering and displaced and homeless. Next, please. And so I think what are the focus on key areas? And I think the implementation gaps are the most important. That is effective promotion of community-led disaster risk reduction plan formulation and fixing priorities in response. So this is one area I think to me is a big gap in IDRiM. Second is equitable recovery process. We have seen n number of cases all over the world how the recovery processes are discriminated. Some most vulnerable are neglected. They are not attended to. And sometimes the funds are used for something else than this. So there is a lot of problems within the equitable recovery process after disaster. Planning for holistic rehabilitation. This is another important gap, I think, implementation gap. That is short-term and long-term disaster. So we have not yet designed or found on mechanisms how we can be holistic in our rehabilitation after disaster. Planning for inclusive resilience and building social capital, focusing on the most vulnerable, disabled, elderly, children. This is also one aspect which I want to emphasize more, is that somehow or other, the most vulnerable segments of the society are, are not fully addressed to, and parts of those have been neglected. For example, disabled people. I was talking to my friend in France. They say they have got a big uh, now protest against the neglect of disabled people with differently, what we call, even call differently challenged people. And they are the most vulnerable in disaster, and they need the disaster. But these are mostly neglected, all parts of the world. Better methods and technique for wholesome assessment of long-term socioeconomic livelihood loss. This is also another aspect which I think we have not yet developed. The economics of or estimation of cost or loss. Has largely been confined to very positive, explicit losses. We have not gone into the aspects of the long-term impact and the hidden losses to the livelihood for a long time. You can imagine after disaster how people suffer in this. We know in Japan, that earthquake, how people for several years suffered because of housing. These sort of gaps are there in implementation. Next, please. Next slide. Next key area is, next, previous one, please. The previous one. Uh, Adapt robust local communication mediums among big people. This is something which I have been thinking. In 1995, I was invited by Nichibun Ken in Japan to study the uh, study the after effect and rebuilding of Kobe. And what I found there, one of the major things complaining to this is a lack of a robust medium for communication after the disaster among people. Most people were searching for their kins and relatives. They don't know where to go. So I thought this is an important area where one has to go into. They started a private radio station, the private telephone connections, and so on. So these are something which need to be attended to very carefully. Better techniques to deal with stakeholders' conflicting interests and create a common table of ownership of DR issue. This is another which Professor Okada also has been stating for a while. How We know about it, that if we have a better implementation, go for better results of IDRiM efforts, then there must be a consensus or unity among the people as stakeholders. How do you bring them to a common table when the stakeholders having different kinds of interests, and how to reduce and resolve these? Some effective positive efforts have been made in this area, but this is also an area where a lot of, so I think a reduction of conflicting interest among stakeholders and to help create a common table ownership of disaster issues and actions among the stakeholders is a very important area to work with. Avoiding potential social conflict through equity in the provision and access to social services, all victims of this. All my studies for different, at least about half a dozen countries have shown how low social conflicts evolve out of inequitable provision and access to the social services, vital social services after to the victims after disaster. So this is another area where very important thing. And the last one I say is the psychosocial counseling. I mentioned about the widening of the realm of IDRiM thinking, that psychosocial aspects also becoming very important after disaster. What we call a trauma, how to deal with the trauma after disaster. So psychosocial counseling and assistance for the community disaster victims. These are, I thought, the key areas. Next slide, please. So how to proceed in this gaps? So the first thing which comes to my mind is this: how to promote or induce a shift of mindset from top-down GRR policy as only way, which we have seen through the 60s and 70s, how top-down policies are imposed even on the local level. Though local level problems and issues are not effectively understood at that higher level, and promote CLDM for a better people-centric ground action area. This I thought is an important to change the mindset. It's a very difficult exercise because it deals with so many governmental mindset, bureaucratic mindset, political mindset, and these mindsets to change, that the one way direct top-down policy is not the only way or not the one way. It has to be synchronized with the people-centric ground action plan of DR. Next is IDRiM Task Force on Implementation Science. I have suggested some for implementation science, a few suggestions. I would like my colleagues for reaction to this. As I said, I welcome very much this idea of implementation task force, which Professor Okada is also now. I think one of the important things I suggest that task force should have 3 working groups for intensive studies. First working group, systematic understanding and analysis of gaps in IDRiM implementation, focusing on trigger factors. Which are the trigger factors which induce, which create these gaps? To understand them and to find out mechanism how to deal with them. Second, equitable recovery and holistic rehabilitation. I talked about it earlier. These two are very important aspects of IDRiM. Third, IDRiM implementation. Third is smart proactive local DAR, the disaster risk reduction governance, and community-led disaster management. This is also an important aspect which the implementation task force must focus on. What, and here I have 2-3 subtitles here saying identify and for removal of systemic hurdles for better collaboration among the government, the community, and the local NGOs and SSGs. Second, leadership promotion. Leadership is very important. So implementation largely depends on what kind of leadership are promoted and what kind of leadership take the helm of affair. And collective division making co-design tools. This is also another important. A collective decision, a co-designing tools for disaster management. How this collective decision and a co-designing tool should be. If it is a co-design tool, it is easily acceptable to all the stakeholders of this. And lastly, I say the task force also should institute a IDRiM leaders forum. And this leaders forum and task force should be an incentive for young and youth people and very passionate people to go ahead with this. Next slide, please. So implementation gap, I say that these are the things. Induce DR research institutions to promote intensive studies and scientific documentation of best practices in disaster management at community level, at in varying contexts. So this is something which we have been talking about for the last more than a decade now. That whenever I search for any net or anything for this sort of information, some information is there or they're scattered. And some information are not reliable. We cannot depend on it. And this is not scientifically done. So there must be a task force work to actually research institutions to promote intensive studies and scientific documentation of best practices at the local level. So that's an important area. I thought the IDRiM implementation task force should do. Next is community capacity in local disaster risk reduction in varying contexts. So I think the contextual element in this is very important. Every country, every context varies. So what are the commonalities in this sort of variation? What are the trigger factors? Leadership, common table ownership action, which we talked about earlier. Collaboration among stakeholders with different interests of skill for preparedness of local plan. Collective risk mapping and implementation strategy. When we talk about people-centric and people should do more involved in local development, what are the skill need to be developed to the people, local people? What are the important things? The plan making, formulation of local and fixing targets. These are important. And also how it can be done, supported by collective risk mapping and implementation strategy, how to develop implementation strategy. So, and then ultimately, the implementation science task force should prepare a synthesis on the lessons from the better practices and so on. Next slide, please. So I also suggest for the implementation task force that they should think about it and promote pilot studies to further refine the lessons learned. We learn lessons from the best practices and so on. So these are also, most of them are secondary sources. So is it possible to take up or induce the research institution, capable and suitable research institution, to take pilot studies and refine the lessons and get to the brass tacks of things? Next is local community level training for skill development. So the skill development of local level is very important. Focus areas are, as I said earlier, collective risk mapping, plan formulation, and target fixation, stakeholders collaboration. These are some of the areas where the local people skill. And this has to come with a very robust, strong training program. And this training program, it has a long, who will do it, Who will design it? Who will really, who are the people going to benefit out of this, and how? And mostly I say these are, I feel, they should be concentrated at the local level or community level. The proposed task force for implementation of science should develop. I, I also another make suggestion. To me, it appears the implementation science task force should develop an open public digital data portal which can be easily accessed publicly and which would contain many of the lessons and we have listed above. Next, please. So I here in the last two slides, I want to suggest that the holistic rehabilitation I talked about and the long-term recovery of long-term livelihood loss. So how to proceed on this? Evolve methods and techniques for systemic estimation of monetary loss in terms of life-sustaining bases and activities. Housing, life assets, loss of ability to recover quickly, and so on. Now, these are some of the areas where the holistic rehabilitation information should be there. Access the effectiveness of the existing available system of assistance and recovery. Fill up the gaps and improve access to all who need assistance. Promote trust. This is another aspect you want to emphasize on. Promote trust and confidence on the system of governance. This way, I have seen myself in my limited areas of research and studies for several years now, that once you lose confidence and trust on the system of governance, then you lose the basic thing of achievement in future. So this is one important thing. And how can it be done? I think through personal contacts, demonstration using pilot projects, demonstration using pilot projects, and personal contacts. These are some of the things who I think would help to strengthen um, trust and confidence over the system of governance. Next, please. Next, I take some details about the recovery after disaster and building better. Building better and recovery. We have been talking about this for some time now. Equity in delivery assistance. Principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality should guide this equity in delivery system. Focus on the most vulnerable. That is how you can focus on them. I said that should be an updated number of location mapping using GPS of most vulnerable. That is elderly, women and children, and the disabled in all areas, local areas, using the actual location. Maybe GPS can be used, even advanced GIS methods should be used to know where they are, how many of them there are, how clustered they are, how scattered they are, and all these things are important to know in the recovery of holistic. Then use of advanced and indigenous construction technology. This is another important aspect we know very well, how indigenous construction technology have withstood very severe disasters in many countries, and what we can learn from those indigenous construction technology. And lastly, strong collective decision making among local government, community leaders, NGOs, SHGs, and donors. So what these all these which I've listed now appear to be a big task to do, but these are important. These are important, and if we neglect those, the whole we will fail in the alternative. The so I and disaster preparedness, I say this. The key input is promote community-led disaster management plan and remove all systemic hurdles for building resilient communities. Second, ensure resilience in infrastructure, external and internal local connectivity, information dissemination systems, habitat and habitat level infrastructure, and focus on hotspots. I think this sort of information should focus on hotspots. So identify hotspots in every locality or areas, then focus on those hotspots to start with. And those are the most vulnerable areas for disaster. Then use of cutting-edge skill development through intensive training for leading actors, including youth, women in DRR, and emergency management. So these are some of the things I have written, but I think these are important. Say, for example, emergency management. Emergency management, we have talked about, and it is being practiced. And there are many gaps in this to how to develop a robust technology and think from the IDRiM side to manage emergency during the emergency and after the emergency. Boost quality education curriculum in schools. This is also the last I would like to say, focus on. So the IDRiM education, IDRiM efforts, IDRiM implementation largely depends on how you train young people's mind. And young people's mind training starts from right from schooling age. So how to inculcate these things in the school curriculum and introduce disaster management, emergency management, disaster direction, and all those aspects of disaster management right from the beginning stage of the schooling. And how to do it, it's a difficult exercise and very challenging exercise, but it is necessary, I think important. Next, please. And this is all what I wanted to talk to you. I think we have just crossed the time also. Thank you very much for your patient hearing. And I will welcome and appreciate any kind of comment and questions. I will just try to respond as much as I can. Thank you very much again. Thank you.